Hi, today we have a special guest, an interview with Dr. Chris Cutrone. Chris is an associate professor of art history, theory and criticism, and visual and critical studies at the School of the Art Institute in Chicago. And he also teaches at the Institute for Clinical Social Work in Chicago. He's the original lead organizer of the Platypus Affiliated Society and the editor of the volume Marxism in the Age of Trump, co-author of Adorno's Leninism, and the forthcoming Marxism and Politics, Essays on Critical Theory and the Party. And is that coming out later this year?
Yes.
All right. And of course, a lot of numerous articles on critical theory and current events as well, many of which you can find on the Platypus Society's website. So the reason why I asked Chris to be with us today is because I recently watched the Platypus Society sessions on YouTube on the American Revolution, which I found really interesting and insightful. And I know I want to talk to you about that, but first, you call yourself the last Marxist, and the slogan, "The left is dead," is also something that I associate with you and that I think is pretty meaningful for you and the society. And you founded the Platypus Affiliated Society. And I think those things are all tied together. So could you explain the name of the society first and what its goals are and how being the last Marxist ties in with that?
Okay, so Platypus got started, the way I think of it historically, with the beginnings of the Millennial left. So in the mid 2000s, in 2006, I had students who came to me, both the University of Chicago, where I was still a graduate student at the time and teaching at the time, and at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And they wanted an extracurricular reading group on the relationship of the material I taught academically to politics. So I taught Frankfurt School critical theory academically, and they wanted to talk to me and have a space outside of class where they could be more political.
Mm-hmm.
So we proceeded to do that. And that was in early 2006. We started reading some essays from the history of Marxism that were directly influential on the Frankfurt School. So things by Karl Korsch and Georg Lukács on, critical theory in Marxism and on philosophy in Marxism. So we did that for a few months, and we looked also at Adorno's writings that were critical of the New Left from the late 1960s. That summer in 2006, so if you recall at the time, this was at the height of the Iraq anti-war movement.
Mm-hmm.
So in 2005, 2006, the US was getting bogged down after invading and occupying Iraq in 2003. So a couple of years in, the US started having trouble there. And this strengthened the anti-war movement. Also, the re-election of George W. Bush in 2004, I think, kind of ginned up the anti-war movement of the time. And a couple of my friends who were fellow graduate students at the University of Chicago were in London in the summer of 2006. And they went to an annual Marxism conference hosted by the Socialist Workers' Party of the United Kingdom, a Trotskyist organization. That's a big event, and that has a lot of speakers, famous speakers on the left who are not necessarily part of their tendency, who are not necessarily Trotskyists, so kind of a broader left event. They went and wrote me from there, because they were there on research over the summer in 2006, but they went to this conference anyway, and they were kind of complaining about the politics and also the young people and how they were being miseducated by the organized, old established Marxist left, which is also something that I had in mind here in the United States. And so they asked me to write a couple of, really a statement, but it ended up being two statements. And those lay out the concept of platypus and why we sort of went from being an extracurricular reading group to being more of a kind of an organized project. And I was inspired to write on this by a longtime friend of mine from college who had had a similar political experience with me. We'd been both members of a Trotskyist organization in college, the Spartacist League.
Mm-hmm.
We were both at Hampshire College, which is a lefty college in Amherst, Massachusetts. And he had found this anecdote from Friedrich Engels, who's Marx's principal collaborator and colleague and friend, lifelong friend and collaborator, about the platypus, the actual animal species of platypus, and how he had read about it in the newspaper, and he thought that it was a hoax, it was made up, that it was the product of English taxidermists who were trying to, pull a gag on the public. But then he went to the zoo and saw a live platypus that they had brought from Australia. And he was kind of ashamed of himself for not believing in the possibility of the platypus. And so, again, it had to do with how a natural creature, an organic phenomenon, from evolutionary history, could defy one's preconceived notions of nature. In other words, something that doesn't seem to quite fit our categories of like mammal and bird and reptile, right, and egg-laying mammal, this kind of thing. And my friend Richard Rubin, thought that this was an apt metaphor or symbol for the kind of place that we found Marxism to be in historically in the early 21st century. In other words, that our understanding of Marxism didn't really fit the established categories, especially on the left, whether academically or in terms of the organized activist left. We felt that that actually our understanding of Marxism, which came from a variety of places, but really from the deep history of Marxism. So from Trotskyism and a particular tendency in Trotskyism, kind of orthodox Trotskyism of the Spartacist League, but also the Frankfurt School that I had studied academically, and also just the earlier history of Marx and Engels and sort of late 19th, early 20th century history of Marxism as a political movement, that it didn't really fit into today's categories politically or intellectually in terms of left and right and, liberal, socialist, capitalist, what have you, right? Communist left, there still is a communist left out there, even after the fall of the Soviet Union. And so we thought it was an appropriate metaphor for thinking about where Marxism ended up in the early 21st century. And that's why I wrote the piece that I did on surviving the extinction of the left. In other words, something like the platypus as a natural species is it's kind of like a living fossil. It seems to be a remnant of like the transition from reptiles and birds to mammals. And so it sort of survives the extinction of maybe other species from millions of years ago and fits only awkwardly into our current classifications of nature and even our imagination of nature, what we think nature is. And so again, it's how history, well, in this case, natural history, could challenge one's conception of things. And that also was quite relevant to the way we thought the memory of Marxism kind of disturbed, if you really thought about it, disturbed the way we think about things now, challenged our present conception of things. So I wrote that because they wanted my friends Spencer Leonard and Sunit Singh, who were in London, they wanted something to distribute at this Marxism conference. They wanted a little leaflet, a little pamphlet. They wanted to do something, And so I wrote it up, and then they wanted further clarification. And so I got some of my students together who were participating in the reading group, and we talked about how to clarify things. And I wrote a short history of the left, which is the sort of follow-up statement. And so those are the two foundational statements. And we ran them by, the kind of more senior the sort of grad students or teachers in Platypus, and also some of the students in Platypus to get some feedback, and then went with it. And so we ended up becoming much more of an organized project, an organization, later in 2007, because we realized that what we were trying to do as an educational project really had to go beyond just a reading group and a kind of informal colloquium or a kind of extracurricular seminar. And so we decided, we read a few books by current authors on the left, and had some of them visit us at the reading group to talk about their work. And we realized that we actually wanted to put on public events. And so when we decided to become an organization, the students wrote up a statement of purpose. And so that's another founding document in early 2007. And we did that in order to establish a proper membership with like voting rights of the members and this kind of thing, and, you know, control over the direction of the project. Because we were doing things that were more public, hosting public fora, you know, public forum panel discussions on the left. And then later in 2007, we started publishing the Platypus Review, which is a monthly broadsheet publication. It's kind of a short format, like one sheet folded over on itself publication that we've been publishing ever since. So we've published like 130 issues almost now, monthly since then. We skip a couple of months during the year to observe academic breaks. So we have a kind of a bi-monthly issue, December and January, and another in July, August. So we publish 10 issues a year. Although early on we tried to publish 12 issues a year, and then in our very first year we didn't quite publish 10 issues. And so, but we ended up kind of falling into a rhythm. And because we were doing these kinds of things, we needed an organization. And we started to spread. So in Chicago, we were at the University of Chicago, and we were at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where my and my fellow teachers, students, like my fellow teachers involved in the project, our students were students at these schools. But then we quickly spread to like DePaul University in Chicago, and then outside of Chicago. So to New York, that was the first place that we moved off into. And I had a student who was an exchange student from Germany, and he ended up starting Platypus in Germany.
Wow.
And I had another student who was a student from Britain, and so the Platypus in the UK got started. So those were our first two countries outside the US. And also we knew people from Canada who quickly started Platypus in Canada. So we were in the United States, Canada, the UK, and Germany early on.
Okay, that explains. I've seen German articles on the website, and I was wondering about that.
We have a German language publication. So we're in Germany and Austria, and we have the Platypus Review in German, which is a separate publication. So sometimes we translate articles from English into German, but often now it's really a German original article publication. And so now we also sometimes publish German articles into English.
Yeah, about how big is the organization at this point, and how cohesive is it? Is it?
It's very cohesive. You know, we are like, you know, a tight membership of a couple of hundred people, and we're in various places in Europe and in North America, also Asia.
Wow.
Yeah, and also recently in Australia.
That says a lot for the traction of the basic ideas that you're putting out there. So congratulations on that. Just like, it sounds like it came about really kind of organically, and you just sort of increasing it as it was received by people. Yeah. What about the left is dead? I'd like you to explain that a little bit more. What do you mean the left is dead?
Okay, so I came up with that catchphrase on my own. So whereas my
Yeah.
friend Richard Rubin came up with the platypus as our totem animal, um, I came up with the left is dead, long live the left. So it's the
Hmm.
left is dead, long live the left. And that had to do with the idea of the extinction of the left, surviving extinction, being a survivor of a broader kind of natural species that suffers a cataclysm. That's how we understood the left and Marxism.
Hmm.
And I formulated that as a provocation to think, to consider, um, and also to register a kind of historical break, a historical discontinuity that I and my colleagues and my students, we saw something in the 2000 aughts. We saw at that time a kind of passing of the new left, the 1960s new left, baby boom generation of the left, and my own generation, the kind of Gen X, like the kind of 80s and 90s generation of the left, never really made a mark of our own. We were always under the shadow of the baby boomers, but the millennials, right, among whom my students were like the older, the kind of earlier and older cohort,
Hmm.
they seem to be turning over a new leaf and really be reconsidering the history of the left and the history of Marxism and reconsidering Marxism and really trying to get out from the kind of orthodoxy, the kind of dogmatism, but also so what Adorno calls dogmatism and thought taboos, the thought taboos
Okay.
of the 60s left, the preoccupations of the 60s left, that again my generation tends to share those preoccupations. The Gen X 80s 90s tends to be derivative and to share those preoccupations and also inhabit those same taboos. But the millennials, at least at first, seem to be open to a deeper reconsideration of these questions of what even defines the left. And our interest in holding public events and even in having a publication, a periodical publication, was about highlighting disagreements, differences on the left.
Mm.
So one of the things that was controversial for us is that the left is definitely very sectarian and kind of internally fractured and kind of siloed into their own cubbyholes.
Hmm.
And every tendency on the left really defines the left in its own way and kind of anathematizes or rejects, counter-identifies with other tendencies on the left that they
Hmm.
cast outside the pale. And so there's like socialists and liberals, like progressive liberals. There's anarchists and Marxists. There's social democrats and communists. There's Trotskyists, Maoists, Stalinists, what have you. There are all these different tendencies on the left that often pretend the other tendencies don't exist. And when they do acknowledge them, are dismissive about them,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yes.
And so we thought, actually the left is dead in a comprehensive way, meaning it's not like one part of the left is actually more vital than any other, that they do have this in common, that they've all reached a kind of dead end and a crisis
Hmm.
in the early 21st century, and that the millennial left, therefore my students, the younger people, were in a position of opportunity to reinvent, reestablish the left, and really sort through and try to make sense of and hopefully transcend the dead weight of history, the dead weight
Hmm.
of history that weighs on the left. Um,
So
and
you,
so that's where that comes from. But long live the left, right? So the idea of the king is dead, long live the king,
yeah.
right? Which is that um, you know it continues, but through a break, through a
Hmm.
change, through a discontinuity. And we wanted to put our finger on that.
So do you want the left to be much more inclusive, to include all these other, instead of eating each other? You basically want to find a way to bring all these variations back together and so
Yes.
actually because an actual movement, a viable movement, hasn't been possible for quite a while, right? In the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union and all of that. So yeah, is that one of the major goals then?
It is a goal, yes. I mean, what I would say is that the left is already united, but in its common kind of death, in its common ruin, and its common lack of vitality. And so the way I describe it is that the history of the left exists only in fragments and shards, and you can't really put Humpty Dumpty back together again. You can't. And the disunity on the left, or the fractiousness on the left, predates the collapse of the Soviet Union. It goes back to the early 20th century and even before that. And so the idea of transcending old differences, which doesn't mean that new differences might not arise, but at least putting stale debates, old stale debates, to bed, to rest. Let the dead bury the dead. Right? That idea. And, you know, again, long live the left in that respect. You know, we thought there was an opportunity there. Now, I'll say a few years ago, I've published an article for the 100th issue of the Platypus Review that is titled "The Millennial Left is Dead." And the reason I wrote that, to mark 10 years of our project and 100 issues of our publication, was because the millennial left did in fact die, meaning it failed to transcend the old stuff. It failed to do that. And one way in which it died very significantly was folding back into the Democratic Party. So the DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, which are, you know, kind of wing of the progressive liberal Democrats, their kind of bubble of growth in the wake of Trump's election, and how all the various different tendencies of the millennial left all found a common home there in the DSA out of anti-Trumpism, which was an unfortunate development in that it meant conceding to the Democratic Party as a kind of default. And I think that's been the case for the left for a long time, that the Democratic Party is the default identity of the left, and that is an expression of its death, of its lack of viability for a long time. So there were moments in which that was not the case. So the 60s New Left, there was a moment there where the New Left rebelled against the dominant Democratic Party, against LBJ, right, against the ruling New Deal Democrat Party coalition in the two crises of that time, which were the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, that were both challenges to the Democratic Party, and through which the Democratic Party transformed itself. So the white Southern Dixiecrats became Republicans, and blacks who were Republicans became Democrats. That change happened in the 60s. And so that moment, right, was a moment in which the left might have departed from the Democratic Party, where they had been since FDR, since the New Deal, because the Communist Party had facilitated that, had collapsed the opposition of the left to the Democratic Party, and to the Republican Party, of course, because the Republican Party actually historically was the progressive liberal party up until FDR, right? And so that change. But in the context of fascism and the Great Depression and World War II, the Communist Party in the United States really lined up the left behind the Democratic Party. And that was shaken in the 60s by the New Left, but ultimately, especially with Reagan, they returned to the Democratic Party, and now again with Trump. So there was early on, even though we started out as like the anti-war movement phenomenon, and so very much pitched against the George W. Bush administration, There was also, of course, a lot of criticism of Obama when he was elected by the millennial left. And it was dissatisfaction with the 2 terms of Obama that led to the Bernie Sanders campaign. But the Bernie Sanders campaign is a way of folding the left back into the Democratic Party.
Well, there just doesn't seem to be, when it comes right down to it, wouldn't they have to form a third party in order to become something different? And so when you get to this point where a Trump is threatening, then it seems like the only practical thing to do is to cooperate with the Democrats, who ultimately then kind of like moderate their tendencies and make them, more realistic about what they can accomplish, or at least in the minds of the Democrats.
And of course, the Democrats created the situation that allowed Trump to come into being politically. In other words, not only was Trump, he was a Democrat, of course, for many years, but also they created the circumstance in which a Trump can emerge, right? And so they're complicit in it, right? Even though they're defined against him, I think it's more important to focus on what they agree on what Trump and the Democrats agree on, which can get lost in all the noise. But they do agree on a hell of a lot. They agree
absolutely. Yeah.
And that gets masked and people get fooled.
Yep, I would agree with the point that the Democrats have kind of abandoned their charge, I guess, or what normally you would think of the Democrats as the party of the working class and the poor. And that's not how they've been behaving for the past few decades. And to me, they kind of remind me of yesterday's Republicans, in a way. and so, to try to influence that party in...
Vice versa, too, by the way. The Republicans are yesterday's Democrats.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Right? And the Democrats don't see that. They don't even see that. The flip.
They see it. They do know it, but they don't say it, right? They don't allow... in other words, these are intelligent people. They know.
I hope so.
At a certain level, they know, but they have to play the game. It's all marketing now.
Yeah.
Right? Pepsi or Coke.
And that's sad. that's very sad. But yeah, I hope they understand that. When I have conversations with other people who are Democrats, I think it comes as news to some of them that their party.
Oh, you mean people who vote for the Democrats? That's different.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm talking about the actual politicians, the professional people. Yeah, they know. Yeah. They know what they're doing. Yeah.
Okay, well, I'm not sure if that's reassuring or not.
Yeah, us fools who are just voters, of course, we fool ourselves into all sorts of things, or we allow ourselves to be fooled. But no, the professional politicians know.
Okay, well, yes, as I said, that may not be reassuring, but you're probably right. Well, what I wanted to get into next, I want to make sure we talk about this lecture series that you guys do have. It's available for everybody to take a look at it on the Platypus Affiliated Society's YouTube channel. But you did several lectures and discussions regarding the American Revolution and what it really should mean as opposed to what has come to be, I guess, how it has kind of in effect gotten stalled, I guess, was kind of one of my takeaways. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and what the general view of the Platypus Society is on the American Revolution and its actual potential and its role in the process of revolution.
Right. So I think that this speaks to the way we approach history. And specifically, we're informed by people like Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School in their approach to history. So Benjamin has this idea of reading history against the grain of what happened, and trying to redeem from history, salvage or rescue from history, its unfulfilled potential. That is still there, right? So it's also an understanding of history that, the famous expression, the past is not dead, it's not even past. because the actions of the past still, they not only reverberate, they actually continue to act, right? So, I mean, I don't know, we're in the midst of the Supreme Court nomination kind of fight. The US Constitution was written, 200 something years ago by the original generation of American revolutionaries. In establishing a political system and a constitutional order, they still act today. Like their action continues today.
Mm-hmm.
And so with respect to history, it's a question of how we act today that interacts with the action of the past.
Okay.
What do we make of the action of the past? How are we trying to modify it, transform it, guide it in a different direction? And, so that idea that, of course, the United States, which is the principal capitalist country in the world and has a very unique position today, but also historically, politically and economically, socially and culturally, right, is the product of that revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And is the product of the fate of that revolution, and obviously impacts the world in a particular way as a function of that revolution. So the American Revolution has, of course, inspired revolutions around the world. It's informed a long historical process. It's helped set terms for how people understand society and politics in every country in the world, in fact. And so there was a time when Marxists in the United States and socialists more broadly than just Marxists, and also liberals more broadly, understood this kind of charge and this task that we inherit as, recipients of the legacy of the American Revolution. Now, we basically tried to engage this topic. There were a few occasions for it. One occasion for it is rather unfortunate, which is the 1619 Project from last year, from the New York Times.
Right.
Which the New York Times editor-in-chief, Dean Baquet, had said that with the failure of trying to impeach Trump for Russia, they would move from Russia to race as the weak point in Trump to try to get Trump. And as part of that, they took the opportunity of the 400th anniversary of the first arrival of African slaves in the Americas, in the English colonies of the Americas, of course, not elsewhere, as a way of reconsidering American history. And even though they've backed off from that, especially recently, they literally sought to replace 1776 with 1619 as the founding moment of American society.
Right, which recasts what the whole country is about, really. Yeah.
Yes, and is a massive distortion, and I think is just wrong, and is, of course, quite conservative in the sense of pessimistic and negative. In other words, it shortchanges the possibilities and tasks facing American society as the inheritor of the revolution. And so, again, by turning the history of the United States into one of white supremacy, like that defines things in a particular way, whereas defining it as capitalism defines it quite differently. So Marxists, a kind of dialectical approach to capitalism that Marxists had meant that they weren't simply anti-capitalists, meaning socialism was understood as a potentiality generated by capitalism itself. Right? And so even if you were to define the United States negatively as capitalist, it actually makes a difference how you define it negatively. If you define it as capitalist, it's a different kind of object, and especially a different potential object of transformation than calling it white supremacist.
Yeah.
And white supremacist, by the way, I don't know about you, but in my lifetime, I feel like this term is now being abused, because in my lifetime, you could talk about racism, but white supremacy was like a deliberate, conscious political ideology and movement, right? That was very specific. It wasn't about like everyday racism.
Right. I think
right?
I think it's being sort of triggered by the fact that we've got these actual, groups of white supremacists that are much more like open and visible right now, that are roaming around in our cities and things like that. But
They're more visible now in a way, but they were always there. In other words, like the KKK, I guess, has been in decline for some time. But neo-Nazis and skinheads and these kinds of people, like they were there when I was young. They were there in New York City and Boston. They were present, you know.
Mhm.
And now I don't think that they've grown any stronger since then. I don't think that they're stronger now than they were when I was younger in the 80s. And I think that generally they're a fringe minority tendency.
Mhm.
It's possible, of course, for extreme ideology to get more publicity now due to the internet, right? But I don't think that they're actually stronger now than before. But I think that there is this idea, and there was when Reagan was elected too. My earliest memories of these kinds of things go back to Reagan in the 80s, even though I was quite young. But the idea that somehow Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush were the favorite candidates of the Ku Klux Klan or of white supremacists, like this is something and that they represented fascism. The Democrats have been saying that about the Republicans since 1948 at the latest, and really before that. Meaning FDR and Harry S. Truman called the Republicans fascists back then. And
Wow.
guess who else called them fascists? The Communist Party,
Uh-huh.
the left, right?
Okay.
They called the Republicans fascists. Dewey, who was the opponent of Harry S. Truman in 1948, I think had been the governor of New York and was definitely what they later called a Rockefeller Republican, namely a liberal Republican. Truman himself called Dewey a fascist.
That's a misuse of the term for sure.
A total misuse of the term. And I see that happening now. In other words, it's really just an abuse of language due to anti-Trumpism, and it's really just Democratic Party rhetoric. It's not at all realistic or accurate. And I
Mhm.
don't think that, actual leftists should use that language.
Well,
Right.
no,
But the New
nor
York Times is Democratic Party. They're not left, right?
yeah, it's
1619 Project is Democratic Party stuff. It's not left, right?
gotcha. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, misuse of the term and overuse of the term means that the term becomes meaningless.
Yeah, I think. I mean, I don't know.
Hmm.
You know, I mean, maybe we're just going to have to use this language from now on, but I don't think so. I think you have to distinguish between um, a social system that has disadvantageous outcomes for people based on historical realities of like the legacy of racism, etc. You have to distinguish between that and a kind of conscious, deliberate political and ideological movement that aims to exclude or exterminate minorities.
Hmm.
Right? I mean, in other words, that matters, right? Like, in other words, if the system seeks to be inclusive, right, but fails to be inclusive, that's a different kind of problem than if the system is consciously, deliberately, actively excluding people. Like I was an anti-apartheid activist in the 80s. That's where I got my start as a leftist. Central American solidarity and anti-apartheid activism, right? There is such a thing as like official racism, right? And that's not what we have in the United States.
Right. I think that people are worried that it's making a comeback, and I hope that you're right. And I think that it's very difficult these days to distinguish, or to figure out what's actually true, because the
Well, I'll tell you
media
this one truth.
amplifies.
I'll tell
Right.
you this one truth, which is that regardless of whether he wins or loses, Donald Trump will get more black votes this time than in 2016, and more Latino votes this time than in 2016. And he already got more black and Latino votes than Mitt Romney or John McCain did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And if Trump wins, that will be the reason why he wins
Mm-hmm.
in
I
the
would
swing
agree with that. I
states.
mean, I've seen the numbers, and I think you're right about that. And I suspect it's because of two things. He does speak directly to working class
Yeah,
concerns in the poor. And also there's a certain amount of the law and order type rhetoric that he uses that appeals because people are living with a whole lot of chaos in cities. And yeah, it
that's
affects them.
right. It will still be a conservative appeal. In other
Mm,
words, like minorities will vote for Trump out of conservatism. It will be conservatism. Law and order is conservatism. And the kind of pitch that he makes about like benefiting from capitalist prosperity, helping the working class in that way. If we help corporate America, it will redound onto the working class. That's conservatism. That is conservatism, right? There's no doubt about that. But, you know, the Democratic Party's appeal is no less conservative. It's just based on a different kind of conservatism.
mm-hmm. Yeah.
So, it's not like, you know what I mean? So the significance of it, all that it shows is that Trump is now winning because of like the support of white supremacists, because they don't amount to, right, they're like hardly anybody.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
Like.
Not the majority. That's for sure. Yes.
Do you know that Richard Spencer, who is
Yeah.
the white nationalist, like he endorsed Biden this time?
Oh, really? Ah.
Yes. And the reason he endorsed Biden and Kamala Harris, it was after Kamala Harris was chosen as the VP nominee. He said they're more effective at preserving America as a white nation than Trump is. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know what? They might be right about that.
Well, they stand for the status quo. I mean, this is why I think Trump won in the first time around, is because people wanted something different. They didn't want the preservation of the status quo, and this was their choice, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a great choice, but it was the choice, right? I mean,
Right.
I mean,
Right. Because enough people know that the Democrats are basically, I mean, again, like I think I've already said this, but they're like Republicans from a few decades ago,
I'll describe my own family background with respect to this. So my family, not entirely, but a large portion of my family voted twice for Obama and voted for Trump, and will vote for Trump again. So they voted for Gore, then they voted for George W. Bush because of 9/11, then they voted for Obama twice, and then they voted for Trump and will vote for him again now.
Mm-hmm.
And so my own background is the Reagan Democrats, the white working class, and they're the swing votes. They are, and they do decide American elections. And they've picked winners. Like they voted for Clinton. They've picked winners for a long time. The only reason that they didn't pick a winner with Gore is because of what we know happened, which is that the Supreme Court stopped the recount, right? Because Gore did win that election, right? I mean, I guess, right? Or you can make that case. So they've always chosen winners, my family. They're bellwethers. And again, they're not racist in that way. They're racist in the usual way, meaning they're conservative. They fear for changing things, and they therefore support a status quo that's disadvantageous for people. That's also disadvantageous for them. But
yeah.
So it's not out of some like racist backlash against Obama, because what my mother and her husband said, because my parents are divorced, they said Obama was a huge disappointment. They didn't hate Obama. They just thought it was a huge disappointment. And you know what? He was a huge disappointment.
He didn't get that much accomplished in the way of real change. Yeah.
Right. For all the hope and change.
Right.
There was very little change and ultimately very little hope in the end.
So are you making a prediction that Trump will win again?
I really don't know. I mean, I think it's possible, at least, and even perhaps likely, but not necessarily probable that Trump will win again. But I think we should be prepared. I think it will shock people more this time than last time, because it seems like he has a 4-year record of screwing up, and so how could he possibly be reelected?
Right.
But that's because people don't understand. Right? They don't understand. The Democrats don't understand the appeal. So we talked about watching the debate last night. The thing that struck me was how similar it was to Hillary versus Trump. How Biden is a little bit different from Hillary, but basically took the same tack, and Trump took the exact same tack.
Sure. It worked.
It worked. It works. It works. People don't understand because they don't believe that it works. They don't understand how it works. But it works. It does work, right?
Yeah. So, and I didn't watch. Frankly, I didn't watch any of the debates from 2016. I didn't watch it, and I know I'm a political scientist. I should have done that, but I just, given the two parties, I decided I just wasn't going to listen. So
they were cringeworthy. They were cringeworthy. They were hard to watch. They were painful. I mean, last night was painful. It's all very painful, right? It's mildly amusing and entertaining if you can like screw your head into the right place, right?
Which I didn't do.
Right, to just be entertained, to just be like, okay, this is what it is, you know. But I did watch. I mean, I kind of set myself the task of paying attention to this stuff because I knew that the left would lie about this stuff, would misrepresent things, and the Democrats especially, but like the degree to which the left is just a kind of adjunct to the Democratic Party. And you know, being in a very liberal arts, like lefty kind of academic setting, I just knew like, okay, I'm a teacher. I have to be prepared to talk about things. And, you know, because I mean, I'm teaching Marxism academically and not just, you know, extracurricularly through something like Platypus, but academically I teach Marxism as well. I teach about it. In other words, I'm not trying to promulgate it. I expose my students to it, and then they do with it what they want. Take it or leave it proposition. I'm not trying to turn them into Marxists, but you know, they hear about Marxism, they read references to Marx in other courses, and I just try to give them the straight up, this is Marxism, whatever we might make of it or not. And inevitably it comes up, okay, so what about this and that, and how does it relate to today? And so I say, well, you know, it's tricky thinking about how these things relate today. It's not a straightforward proposition. Some things might be straightforward, apparently, but actually it's rather complicated. And so, you know, but the first thing you have to do is not fall into the rhetoric of mainstream politics, you know, because of course when Trump denounces like Marxism and socialism and this and that, he's not talking about what I understand those things to be. And when the Democrats, like when Bernie Sanders talks about democratic socialism, that's also not what I think it is. And when they call Trump a fascist or this and that, it's not the way I understand these things. And so I feel like the first thing you have to do is just bracket that and not be like triggered, if you will, and not feel like, oh, how is this Marxism? How is this socialism? It's not. And, you know, and also how people define capitalism, how they understand capitalism. Because even the Democrats will say, like Nancy Pelosi will say, I'm a capitalist. Let's get real, we're capitalists. And I'm like, I guess so. But, you know, what you mean by that is not what I would mean by it.
Well, I could ask you what do you mean by it, but and maybe I do want to ask that question. Hold on. But also, do you think, like more immediately, is the left in a better position? Is the left, the real left as you see it, in a better position if Trump wins? And if so, why?
I don't think so. I don't think it's better or worse. You know, for me, it's a teaching opportunity. You know, being a teacher, it's a teaching opportunity, which means it's a learning opportunity, meaning I have no control over who's elected, right? At all. Like, I have no influence, but also I don't go out there and say you should vote for this or vote for that, right? I just don't, because I don't believe I can endorse any of the options on order, on offer, I should say. On order, right? On offer. And so, you know, that's not what I do. And so the question is, come what may, how does it become a teachable moment? Because it kind of has to become a teachable moment. Like, we may not like the teachable moment, but it's there, and my task as a teacher, as an educator, is to make things into teachable moments. And so I think that in that respect, I've always been concerned with the likelihood of a Trump election to begin with, likelihood of a re-election by Trump, and to be prepared for making it a teachable moment. And also 4 years of living under Trump, dealing with the daily outrage or whatever, trying to make it into a teachable moment of some kind or another. This maybe comes back to the lecture series on the American Revolution.
Yeah, I want to
legacy
that too. Yeah.
So that's the other occasion for it, was the election. And I wrote about this in one of my presentations on the American Revolution and the left, not part of the lecture series because it's more about the present than about history, in which I said, an election in the United States is a major political event, not only in the United States, but in the world. And a constitutional transfer of power is like a revolution. That's why we talk about these revolutions. We talk about the Reagan Revolution, right? And it's why, like Bernie Sanders said, we need a political revolution, by which he meant an election. And it's why Trump says he's not the leader of a political party, but of a movement, right? And that he's trying to redefine the Republican Party and redefine American politics in general, right? So this is how we make revolution in the United States, at least within a certain framework, within the constitutional order. And also because Trump and the Republicans more generally are seen as like the opposition, right? Because we're still living in a basically New Deal America. The welfare state, that was new with the New Deal is still there. It's been modified slightly with neoliberalism, but it's still basically there. And so is it a threat to the constitutional order? Right? That's what it means to call like Reagan a fascist. It's what it means to call Trump a fascist. It's what Harry S. Truman meant by calling Dewey a fascist. He's saying the Republicans are trying to undo the political system that we've established with the New Deal. Now, of course, the Republicans don't do any such thing. They might modify it. They might appear to chip away at it, but they don't really fundamentally undo it because it's not really possible to undo it at this point. So that was the other, Herbert Marcuse said something in the 70s, Frankfurt School thinker. He said that he's teaching in the United States. He was at University of California, San Diego. He had been living in the United States since the Nazi era as an emigre. And he said, freedom of speech is great, but maybe we should ban freedom of speech for people who call for canceling the welfare state, because only a fascist would call for that. And he should have known better. He should have known better, right? Yeah. But I kind of understand what he means, because of course nobody actually gets rid of the welfare state. What they do is they modify it. They don't actually remove it.
Sure, yeah.
And they couldn't. And the only people who would try to do that would be fascists. That's true, right? But he when he said that, he meant Ronald Reagan, right? Who already was trying to run for president at the time, because he had a couple of go-rounds before being elected in 1980. And he should have just known better. I mean, I know that Reagan was a bad governor of California who persecuted Marcuse as a faculty member at University of California, San Diego, but nonetheless, right? And so I feel like the legacy of the American Revolution, the meaning of it, the ramifications of it, its continued life, continues all the time, but especially in a general election, especially in an election for the president, which is the only election that all Americans participate in equally, right? Albeit through the state system, the Electoral College, but it's the only office on which everyone votes in the United States is the presidency. And the presidency is, as Attorney General William Barr put it, the perfected Whig ideal of the executive coming out of the English Revolution, the English Glorious Revolution, but before that, the English Civil War. And it is like an elected monarch. It is like the president is like an elected monarch, albeit with the checks and balances, but still, has a great deal of power and authority.
One has gained a lot more in
And
the
gained a
past
lot
few
more.
decades, right? Yeah.
That's true. Gained a lot more for a while, and really in the era of capitalism, right? The imperial presidency, you could say, goes back to Abraham Lincoln, even, right? It has a long history. And the necessity of that kind of executive authority in the functioning of capitalism, and especially with the US as the premier world capitalist country in a dominant position in the global political order, presidency is obviously very important. And so the question of what is this system that the American Revolution gave us? What is it? That question is posed every time we have an election, sometimes more strongly posed than others, but it is actually posed every time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when I was a young person, George Herbert Walker Bush, when his presidency was interrupted by Bill Clinton in 1992, when Bill Clinton denied him a second term, but really it was Ross Perot who denied him a second term. That's what allowed Clinton to win. George Herbert Walker Bush got on TV and he said, in the United States, we accomplish through elections what in other countries require revolutions or civil wars.
Yep, which is kind of a miracle. It really is that we managed to do that.
It's true, right? It's true. And also, we should never forget that the Civil War was provoked by an election. By the election of Abraham Lincoln. That was the occasion for it. Right? And so that's why people are talking about, will there be a civil war coming out of this election?
Yeah.
Of course, it's always possible. I think very unlikely, but it is always possible.
Yeah, I doubt if that's going to happen either. I could see quite a bit of civil strife as we sort of sort things out and try to stabilize, but civil war, probably not. It's probably not a situation. But so like these elections every 4 years are potential kind of moments when a sort of revolution could occur or the revolutionary tendency could continue, right?
The specter is raised.
Right. Yep. And so this election, well, no matter what, is probably a missed opportunity for that, right? But
oh, sure.